What if an entire American armored division rolled into position along a dangerously exposed stretch of front line? Tanks rumbling, radio traffic crackling, engines echoing for miles in every direction, and none of it was real. What would you do if German intelligence, monitoring every signal, listening to every engine, plotting every reported position, built their entire defensive response around a force that did not actually exist? And what happens to a battle plan when the 22-mile gap in the American line it was designed to exploit turns out to be guarded by 600 men, sound trucks, and inflated rubber tanks instead of the thousands of soldiers German commanders believed were there? In September of 1944, in a small town called Bettembourg, that is exactly what happened, and General George Patton's exposed flank held for 6 days because of it. We'll show you exactly how they pulled it off in a moment. First, you need to understand who these men actually were, and why the United States Army handed a combat mission to artists, sound engineers, and radio operators instead of soldiers. They called themselves the Ghost Army. For 50 years, almost nobody was allowed to know they existed at all. The threat by September of 1944, General George Patton's Third Army had raced across France with a speed that had outpaced its own supply lines, and in several sectors, its own available manpower. As Patton pushed toward the German border, a genuinely dangerous gap opened along a roughly 20-mile stretch of the Third Army's front near Bettembourg, Luxembourg, an area that, on paper, should have been defended by a full armored division, but was, in reality, guarded by almost nothing at all. German forces, probing for exactly this kind of weakness, represented a real and immediate threat to an exposed flank that, if exploited, could have inflicted serious damage on an American army whose rapid advance had left it dangerously overextended. The genuine combat units capable of covering that gap were needed elsewhere, actively engaged in other sectors of the advancing front, and there was no way to conjure an actual armored division out of nothing to plug the hole in time. What 3rd Army Headquarters did have available was the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, a roughly 1,100-man unit activated in January of 1944 and specifically built, from its very first day of existence, around an entirely different kind of warfare. Its soldiers were artists recruited from art schools and advertising agencies, sound engineers pulled from radio studios, and signal corps specialists trained in the specific, obscure skill of mimicking another radio operator's individual sending style on Morse code closely enough to fool a trained listener on the other end. Their job was not to fight. Their job was to convince the German army that an entire division was standing in a place where, in reality, 600 men and a few dozen trucks loaded with inflatable rubber decoys were all that actually existed. The concept behind the unit did not originate from scratch within the American military. It drew directly on lessons learned from British deception operations earlier in the war, particularly Operation Viersen, the elaborate ruse that had helped conceal Allied preparations before the Second Battle of El Alamein in North Africa in late 1942. Ralph Ingersoll, a journalist and later Army officer who helped conceive of the unit, worked with British planners in London to adapt those lessons into an American formation, recruiting men specifically for their creative and technical skills, rather than conventional combat aptitude. The resulting unit represented something genuinely new in American military history. The first mobile, multimedia tactical deception force the Army had ever fielded, built on the premise that a battlefield illusion, convincingly executed across multiple sensory channels at once, could accomplish what an actual division of soldiers would otherwise have been needed to do. The secret development: there was no single secret weapon behind what the Ghost Army accomplished at Bettembourg. What there was, instead, was a carefully layered combination of 3 distinct deception techniques, all deployed together at once, each one reinforcing the illusion the others were creating. The unit's largest component, roughly 380 men from the 603rd Camouflage Engineers, handled the visual layer of the deception, inflating rubber tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces, and arranging them into positions designed to look convincing to German aerial reconnaissance, and to any distant ground observer scanning the horizon with binoculars. A separate radio deception unit, staffed by operators who had spent months training to replicate the individual rhythm and style of specific real units' actual radio operators, filled the airwaves with fabricated traffic, impersonating the communications of the genuine armored division that was supposed to be occupying the sector, so convincingly that German signal intelligence listening in had no reliable way to distinguish the fake transmissions from real ones. And a third component, roughly 145 men trained in what the unit called sonic deception, drove specially equipped half-tracks mounted with powerful speakers to positions near the front line and played pre-recorded sound effects, engines idling, tank treads grinding, men shouting orders, broadcast loud enough to be heard for miles across the quiet Luxembourg countryside at night. At Bettembourg, all three techniques ran simultaneously for more than a week, the longest sustained deception operation the unit conducted during the entire war. Colonel Clifford Simonson, the operations commander, later called it the first mission the unit executed fully professionally and correctly, a turning point that demonstrated exactly how effective the combined technique could be when every layer of the illusion, visual, radio, and sonic, worked together to reinforce a single, consistent story for German intelligence to believe. The logistics of maintaining that illusion for more than a week, rather than the single night or two that most of the unit's earlier operations had required, presented challenges nobody had fully anticipated when the mission began. A convincing deception could not simply be set up once and left running. Real armored divisions moved, repositioned, and generated a constantly shifting pattern of visible and audible activity, and a static illusion, however elaborate its initial setup, risked appearing suspiciously unchanging to a patient, observant enemy. The men of the 23rd found themselves continuously repositioning their inflatable decoys, varying their sonic broadcasts, and adjusting their fabricated radio traffic day after day, essentially performing an ongoing piece of improvised theater with no script and no room for a single mistake, for over a week straight, fully aware that a moment's inconsistency could unravel the entire illusion and expose the genuinely undermanned sector to exactly the kind of attack it was meant to prevent. Technical supremacy. There is no chapter in this story about conventional firepower, because the entire operating premise of the Ghost Army depended on convincing an enemy of overwhelming strength without ever actually possessing it. The radio deception component required a level of technical and theatrical skill that went far beyond simply broadcasting fake messages. Operators had to study and replicate the specific, individual sending patterns of real radio operators from the units they were impersonating, because experienced German signal intelligence personnel had learned to recognize individual operators by the subtle rhythm and cadence of their Morse code, the same way a handwriting expert might recognize an individual script. A convincing impersonation meant the difference between an illusion that held and one that immediately gave itself away to any German listener paying close attention. The unit's radio operators trained extensively to master this specific skill, effectively learning to forge another person's signature using nothing but the timing of electrical pulses. The sonic deception component presented its own distinct technical challenge. Sound behaves differently across open countryside than it does in a controlled environment, affected by wind, terrain, humidity, and temperature in ways that could make a recording sound convincingly distant and authentic on one night, and obviously artificial on another. The unit's sonic specialists had to constantly adjust volume, distance, and playback timing to account for these variables, essentially conducting a live sound design exercise under combat conditions, with German patrols and observers as an unwitting and highly consequential audience. Later in the war, the sister unit supporting the 23 RD's operations, the 3133rd Signal Company Special, refined the technique further, mounting speakers inside M10 tank destroyers nicknamed Slugs, specifically to give the sonic deception a mobile, armored platform that could operate closer to actual frontline positions, without the crews manning them being left dangerously exposed. The recordings themselves, produced before the war by engineers at the Army's own experimental sound laboratory at Fort Knox, represented a genuinely sophisticated technical achievement for the era. Sound engineers had traveled to record actual armored units in training, capturing the specific acoustic signature of tanks maneuvering, trucks idling, and infantry moving into position, then mixed and layered those recordings onto specialized phonograph records designed to be played back at variable volumes depending on how distant and how large a force the deception needed to simulate. Convincing illusion of an entire armored column moving into position might draw on a carefully sequenced combination of these recordings, played in a specific order, and at specific volumes calculated to suggest a plausible, gradually developing military buildup rather than a single implausible burst of activity. It was, in effect, an early form of sound design for a live, high-stakes performance where the only audience that mattered was an enemy intelligence officer trying to decide whether what he was hearing was real. The global impact, the deception at Bettembourg held for the better part of a week, and the dangerous gap in Patton's line that German forces might otherwise have identified and exploited remained, in the enemy's own assessment, defended by a substantial armored force. When the genuine armored units the Ghost Army had been impersonating finally arrived to actually occupy the sector, the illusion was quietly withdrawn, sonic trucks playing the sounds of a departing convoy specifically to maintain the story that the Phantom Division was simply relocating rather than admitting it had never existed at all. Across the full span of the war in Europe, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops and its sister unit carried out more than 20 documented deception operations across France, Luxembourg, Belgium, Germany, and Italy. At various points, convincingly simulating the presence of forces, the unit's own historians have estimated at up to 2 full divisions, roughly 30,000 men, using barely 1,100 soldiers of their own. Their operations supported the broader Operation Fortitude deception campaign preceding the Normandy invasion itself, and one of their final and most significant missions, Operation Viersen in March of 1945, successfully convinced German commanders that an Allied river crossing of the Rhine was being prepared far north of where the actual attack ultimately took place, drawing German defensive attention and resources away from the real crossing point at a critical moment in the war's final months. The human cost the unit's deceptions prevented is difficult to calculate with precision, but the Ghost Army's own historians and the military analysts who eventually studied the unit's declassified records have estimated that its operations saved between 15,000 and 30,000 American lives across the course of the war, casualties that would very likely have occurred had German forces accurately understood. At any of the 20-plus critical moments, the unit staged its illusions, exactly how thin and exposed the real American lines actually were in front of them. That estimate, while impossible to verify with the same precision as a body count or a captured document, rests on a reasonably solid foundation. Military planners calculating the estimate compared each documented deception operation against the realistic alternative, an actual undermanned or entirely undefended sector, and modeled what a competent German commander, correctly informed of the true situation, would likely have done with that knowledge. In sector after sector, from the exposed flank at Bettembourg to the far larger strategic deception supporting the Normandy landings themselves, the pattern held consistently. German forces that might have exploited a genuine gap in the Allied line instead redirected their attention, their reserves, and often their offensive planning toward a threat that existed only in carefully engineered sound, static, and rubber. Whatever the precise number ultimately turns out to be, the underlying logic behind it is sound, and it points to one of the more unusual conclusions available from the entire war. That a unit which never fired a shot in anger may have done as much to protect American soldiers' lives as many far larger combat formations that fought and bled for the same stretch of ground. Conclusion: the Ghost Army's story remained almost entirely classified for 50 years after the war ended, the unit's members bound by a level of continued secrecy that meant even their own families often had little idea what they had actually done during their service. Veterans of the unit, many of them talented artists who went on to notable post-war careers, including future fashion designer Bill Blass and abstract painter Ellsworth Kelly, simply could not discuss the specifics of a mission the government had decided needed to remain hidden long after the shooting had stopped. That secrecy finally lifted in the 1990s, as records were declassified and historians began piecing together the full scope of what the unit had accomplished. And in 2022, Congress formally recognized the surviving members and the memory of those who had already passed with the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the highest civilian honors the United States government can bestow. It was a recognition, 78 years in the making, awarded to a unit whose entire purpose had been to convince the enemy that something existed which, in reality, never did. German radio operators who spent the autumn of 1944 tracking phantom convoys, cataloging fabricated unit designations, and reporting troop concentrations that existed nowhere except in a carefully engineered illusion of sound, static, and rubber, never got the chance, in most cases, to learn exactly what they had actually been listening to. What they heard that night, and on 20 other nights across the final year of the war, was never explained to them because it was never meant to be explained at all. It was meant only to be believed for exactly as long as American lives depended on the lie holding together. By the time the last living veterans of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops received their Congressional Gold Medal, most of them were well into their 90s, a handful of elderly men standing in for the 1,100 soldiers who had spent a year of their youth pretending, again and again, to be something they were not. Their unit's peculiar service record, measured not in enemy soldiers killed or territory captured, but in illusions successfully maintained, and lives quietly preserved through deception rather than direct combat, does not fit easily into the conventional framework most military histories use to measure success. That is precisely why their story remained obscure for so long, and precisely why, once it finally became known, it earned its place as one of the more genuinely remarkable chapters of American service in the entire war, proof that a division's worth of impact could sometimes be achieved by 600 men, some sound recordings, and a truckload of rubber tanks that were never real at all.